Gracious God, may the words of my mouth and the meditation of all of our hearts be acceptable to you, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Around 4,000 years ago, give or take, a man went on a journey. He left a hometown he knew, a family he loved. He loaded his carts and camels with the people that meant most to him, and he set out. And he didn't do this because he was on the lam. And he didn't do this in search of fame and fortune. He didn't do this because he had a Jones for adventure. Abraham did this simply because God asked him to. God didn't tell him where he was going or why he was going, but only that once he got there, he would be blessed and would be a blessing. Follow me, God says, and through you, something amazing is going to happen. For those of us gathered here today and those of us who will gather later this afternoon, for Christian, for Jew, for Muslim, this is how our faith began, with an immigrant on a journey into the unknown, seeking only to be blessed and to be a blessing. God promised Abraham that he would give rise to a community that would be a light to the nations, to be a beacon whose actions and values would draw other communities to them, whose mission would be to enlighten the world through our reflection of God's love within it. And so 4,000 years later, as descendants of that blessing, I think it's time to ask ourselves, how's that going so far? I think the answer would be decidedly mixed. For like Abraham, our journey of faith is anything but linear. We are very susceptible to, shall we say, detours. Pride, greed, fear, power on a personal and a national scale. We lose our way more often than we care to admit, just as Abraham did. Because like us, Abraham was not a perfect person. Refreshingly, no one in Genesis is. It's not a book of superheroes, but of way too human heroes. Abraham, Isaac, Ishmael, Sarah, Rachel, Joseph, they each have moments of courageous faith and even more moments of human frailty. Jealousy, anger, insecurity, hubris, they have them all. And even as they dare to follow God's call in their time and place, in their generation over the centuries, longing to be blessed and inspired to be a blessing, they can't help but repeat the classic pattern of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It's what we humans do. We get so close to being the people and community who God calls us to be, and then we let it all fall apart. So that's the human story in our scriptures, and it's the story that we continue to live today. But there's another story in those sacred texts, God's story, and it tells us something quite different. God's story tells us that no matter how many times we drop the ball, get it wrong, let our human doubts and frailties get in the way, God never loses faith in us. Our human limitations and detours are no match for the future that God dreams for us. The one God dreams for Abraham is the same one she offers us today. The journey still beckons. The promise still stands. The blessing remains. We just have to leave behind everything that doesn't matter, pack our bags, take a step, and keep trying. Even in our darkest moments, God tells us, follow me, and you will be a blessing to all, a light to the nations, a community chosen to care. Our job, of course, like it was for our ancestors in the faith, is to figure out what living into that promise means for us here, now, in our generation. What does it mean to be a blessing in a world where divisions of faith or creed or ethnicity inspire fear inspire the building of walls and the closing of borders instead of bridges? What does it mean when the loudest voices use God's name to incite terror and bigotry? What does it mean to be a caring global community when we would rather buy the cheapest goods possible than pay a living wage to those who make them? What does it mean when our lifestyles of convenience burden our most vulnerable neighbors? What does it mean to be a light to the nations when so many of our leaders want to turn away the immigrant and stranger and lead from a place of fear? Now, firm answers elude us, and debates rage between us. But I think there is a guiding truth that we can carry with us. For if you peel back the layers of our fears, we will most find ignorance at its source. Because we don't understand each other, we are afraid of each other. We forget that we began this journey together. And so our quest to be a light to the nations must begin not by seeing each other as others, but as family. God invited Abraham to leave his homeland, not to wander aimlessly in the wilderness, but to change his identity from one who was rooted in clan and tribe and culture to one who is rooted primarily in his relationship with God. And that's what a journey of faith is all about. It's a shift in identity that puts God at the center of our lives. And if God is at the center, we are all connected. But it's the ultimate religious paradox, isn't it? Especially for those of us who root our religious identity in our specific faith tradition. The paradox is that in order to become the blessing that God calls each of us to be, we need to step away from the religious distinctions and doctrines that divide us and remember our common identity that started it all. I cannot speak for how that has challenged my Jewish and Muslim brothers and sisters, and we will hear from them later. But I am intimately aware of how tragically we have failed to live into God's promise as Christians, as followers of Jesus. For even as our faith shows us the extravagantly inclusive, transcendent, and welcoming love of God, we continue to default to our human-made divisions. We cling to our smallness and our borders, our national and religious identities, and it blinds us from seeing God in our neighbors. We share the stories of the radically compassionate and boundary-breaking Jesus here each Sunday, who healed Samaritans and Syrians and welcomed outcasts, and we still don't get it. We default to fear of the other. But there is good news. For just as God continues to offer us and each generation another chance to get it right, Jesus doesn't give up on us either. And so it is in his name that we share a powerful ritual, one that helps us remember our shared kinship as one family of God. For whenever he shares a meal, not just at the Last Supper, but every time he breaks bread, Jesus breaks all the rules and invites everyone to come and join him. There is no lit test of belief or behavior to come to the table. He simply asks, "Are you hungry? We've got more than enough. Are you lonely? There's a place for you. Have you been rejected? You're welcome here." Friends, this is the God we worship, and this is the kind of table that we are invited to today. The sacrament of communion is an invitation into the merciful heart of God. It is where we find our common home and our common identity across all of our human differences. And yet, in the deepest and most tragic of ironies, this sacrament has too often been held up as a point of exclusion of God's children, not inclusion. In many Christian traditions, there is indeed a litmus test required in order to come to the table. If you do not believe in a certain way or behave in a certain way, you are turned away. But not here. Here we see this table as the place where we remember that we are one family, that we set aside all the differences of tribe and culture and practice and find our common heart in God. Here, where all are welcome, abundance is celebrated, and no one is turned away, it's how we practice what it means to be a blessing to the world and a light to the nations. And so may our sharing here today be a flame to illuminate God's love in our lives. May our voices be raised to spread messages of hope and peace in a fearful world. And may our time at this sacred table nourish us, body and soul, for the journey that we continue together. May we truly be blessed to be a blessing to all. May it be so. Amen.